Hey, it's Tom, and today we're going to build a very simple app in React.js. Through the process of building the app, I will try to explain all the basic concepts of React.js, so we can think about this video like a React tutorial for beginners. Okay, so let's jump to the details. As you see, I prepared some source code to just save our time. So we have a basic index HTML, which is just a template from VS Code. I just added a link to the Bootstrap to don't lose time on styling the project. We have only one div in the body. It currently contains a string empty, and it has ID that we'll use later. So in the package, right now I would like to explain why we won't use the create React app, which is very popular and very common in many products. So I honestly strongly believe that to understand the technology, it's really worth to build some project from scratch. And there's no better way than just adding everything manually to understand what's really needed, what we really use, and how to use it. So in this project, as you see, we have only a couple dependencies, and in Create React App, you will have thousands of dependencies, and you will probably never understand what they're doing and if you really need them or not. So in the dependencies, we have rich router, which will allow us to navigate between different pages. We have the React, which is the React.js library core, and React DOM, which allows us to manipulate the DOM. In the dev dependencies, we have parcel bundler, and parcel is relatively new bundler for JavaScript. And it's amazing because it works with zero config. So we just add it, we just call the parcel index HTML, and we got the hot reload without any config and any other additional work. And there is also prettier to just make the code looking as good as possible without losing time for formatting. So in scripts sections, I just added the script called dev, and as I mentioned, it's just calling the parcel and provides the index HTML. So right now, if we will call the npm run dev script, it will call parcel, as you see. Project was built, and right now we should see, very rich website with empty content. Okay, so let's start with the React. At the beginning, we need to create our first React component, and we can call it app.js. So to just explain, we will use the JSX syntax, and JSX it's just a syntax extension for JavaScript. You can think about this like some kind of template language, but it comes with the full power of JavaScript, and the goal of using JSX is to just create React elements. So at this point, we need to import React from React. Okay, and we need to import React DOM from React DOM. Okay, I also set the prettier to format code on save, so don't be surprised by just reformatting the code from time to time. So we have to create our first component, and at this point I would like to explain you that there are two types of components in React.js. So in general, component is just a function that returns React elements. Components let us split the UI into independent, reusable pieces, and that's the goal, to have reusable pieces, to have the code as separated as it's possible. And in general, they are just like JavaScript functions. They accept inputs called props. It's just one input, and return created React elements, which describe what should appear on the screen. The simplest way to define a component is to just write a JavaScript function which accepts single props parameter and returns React element. We call it function component. However, with using the ES6 syntax, we are also allowed to create the classes, and then we can create class components, so-called. There are some differences between them, but in this tutorial we will build both the class component and couple function components, which are currently much popular because of hooks. We'll go to the hooks later on. Okay, so let's build our first component. It will be called app. We'll just use arrow function syntax, because app doesn't, we won't use any props in the app, so we can just directly call return. And the rule is that return has to return only one top element, so we can do something like this and test React, but we cannot do something like this because there are two elements, so we would just have to wrap them into, we would have to wrap them into another div. And yeah, right now the syntax is proper, but for our testing purposes we can leave it as it is. Okay, and then we have to use React DOM to render that. To render the app, and we will just go to the document, get element by ID, and this will be the element root. So this line will okay, we have to add this script also here. So we add script with the source of app.js. Okay, so right now the index.html has one script, and that will be our entry point to the project, and it's called app.js. So right here, as I mentioned, we created, it's React DOM. Okay, so this is the function component that gets one parameter called props, but we won't use that here, so we can use the arrow function syntax and just skip it, and it will return as a created React component. It will be a div with the string test React, and this line React DOM will manipulate the DOM, so it will render the app component and it will put it into root element of the HTML. So as I mentioned, we already have the hot reload, so hopefully, yeah, test React. There's no hot reload, but maybe because there was no script before. So yeah, we have test React. Looks like we created our first component and rendered it into HTML, so we can finish the tutorial. Thank you for watching. Okay, I'm just joking. Okay, so the basic rule is that app in most cases is our just entry point, and in this part we can leave it as it is and create our first other component, in which we will learn many other things. So it will be our dashboard. dashboard.js. And right now in app.js, we can just import dashboard from dashboard, and we will just return the dashboard component. Okay, so right now our app.js will be just a wrapper that will present the dashboard.js component, and our dashboard.js will be a class component. So let's import React from React. Okay, and create dashboard component, and that extends React component. Okay, and right now I can explain you what's cool about the class components. So at first they have life cycle methods. So you can access the methods like component will mount, component did mount, component will unmount, and they are called at the specific time of the life cycle of the component. You can read more about it on React in React documentary. But they also have the constructor, which allows us to super props, and constructor gets the props just like the function component. So it allows us to config the class before we will render that. So, and the other difference is that class components need to have a render method, and this render method return content just like the function components do. So we can start with writing the real code. So maybe let's start with container. Okay. So we have our first container, and this website, this page will contain a simple form that will allow us to put the app ID into the input field, submit the form, fetch the reviews from the Apple RSS, and then we'll just try to present them, of course. Okay, so we have our container. We can create a first row. We are still using the bootstrap, so that's why we use the class names to format it somehow. P3 means we are just adding some simple padding, and right here we'll create our first form. So class name, we can make it with full width. Okay, so we have our simple form, and in this form we will just create a so in this form we will create an input field and submit button. So we need to create another div with class name form group. Okay, you can put label, and it will be app ID. and then we put input, and that's the tricky part. Okay, form control, ID of this input is app ID. Okay, so maybe let's leave it as it is, and below we'll just add a button to submit. Okay, type submit. Okay, so we have our very simple form. Let's check if this will render at all. Okay, it won't render. Oh, okay, of course it won't render because we didn't export default dashboard. Okay, yeah, we have our very simple form. Yep, looks like working. Okay, so right now we can go to the most tricky part of this. So we would like to handle the submission of the form. So, and we would also like to have the access to the data which is in input. And for that case, we will just use a state. So there are two types of common variables. So the props, as I mentioned, that are provided by the parent to the child component, and we are not allowed to modify them. And there is a state. So there is a, as the name says, it's the current state of the component. So it's the storage that we could use to store some data. And the rule is that we create this default values for state in the constructor. So in our case, we will just need reviews. It will be an empty array. Later on, we'll just put all the fetched reviews into this variable in state, and app ID, which might be empty string. Okay, that looks pretty okay. And right now, we will just bundle the state, the app ID, to the value of the input. So we could do something like this. So the value of this input will be this state app ID. Okay, and this will work. However, we are not editing that here, as you see, and that's the very common syntax in JSX. So in those curly braces, you can put the JS operations, JS variables, and you can work within those curly braces like in a normal JavaScript. Okay, so we have the value. Oh yeah, now it looks much better. And we also have to update the value. So on change, we have an event, and we'll use the arrow function once again, and we will modify the state. So we can just modify any part of the state. We don't have to override all of them. And in our case, our app ID will be equal to the target value. Okay, so this should work. However, yeah, let me comment that and show you something. So I'm just typing, but the value of the input is the current value taken from state. And if we are not updating the state, it will never change. So if we are calling the onChange and updating the state, it will be automatically binded with the with this value, and the value of the input will be updated. So okay, make sure, yeah, as you see, we are able to update that. Okay, so we have this step. Let me maybe copy the app ID of the Twitter app, so I won't have to write it manually every time. And as you see, I just set the default value for app ID. So every time the component will re-render, the default value will be put into our input. So I won't have to write this ID manually. Okay, so we can go back here. And right now, our form, while being submitted, will just reload the web page. But of course, we would like to prevent that. So we just have to go to our form and change on submit method. Okay, on submit. Once again, we'll use the arrow function syntax. Okay, and now we would like to prevent default behavior. So, and we would like to call fetch reviews. Okay, that should work. If only we would have the fetch reviews method. So let me copy the method I just prepared. Maybe just I will write it and just copy the URL. So request. This method will use the fetch to get the reviews from the website, and that's the URL. So in general, yeah, okay, it's very simplified version. So we have the RSS of provided by Apple. We'll just fetch the first page. We won't modify that, and the ID of this URL will be taken from state. So it will be binded with this value of the input. So we provide that here, and that gives us the whole URL. So we can console log URL. Okay, and right here we'll just like to call it request reviews. Okay, right now it should work. So we can just inspect the website. Okay, there's some error in Bootstrap, but it doesn't matter for us. Yeah, and as you see, we have the proper URL, iTunes Apple customer reviews page 1 ID is equal to the state app ID. It's sorted by most recent, and it will be formatted to JSON. And the country will be US, just to make everything simpler. Okay, right here we'll just use the fetch to get the data from URL, and then the response is in JSON. Okay, have to bind once again. And then there is a result. And error. Okay. Yeah, that should work fine. If there's an error, we can log it. Okay, and if there is a result, we would like to store it into our state, because this is how we do it here. So reviews is result feed entry. I just know the structure of this data because I'm working with that for a long time already. We can log it, reviews, okay. And yeah, maybe just try to fetch it and log. Yeah, we fetched the data. Looks like it's okay. We have 50 reviews. Yep, they're all JSON objects, so that's good. And right now, we would like to set it. Yeah, but with the structuring syntax, we can just yeah, that's the most readable way to store it in state, but with the structuring feature we can do it like this, and this will also work. This will set our reviews object and assign to a reviews key from the state. Okay, so we got the reviews. So right now we would like to present them, I believe. So if we have our form below, we can put the list of reviews. So right here, we will learn something about the conditional rendering. So JSX allows us to use JavaScript if syntax. It's very similar to if syntax to either render something or not. And that's very useful when we have something like the list, like we will have right here. And if there are no elements, we can put nothing. And if there are some elements, we can just present a list of the objects. So right here, we would like to this state reviews. Actually, I would like to make one change right here, because we can also use the structuring feature const to get app ID and the reviews. Sorry, curly braces, from the state. And thanks to that, we will be able to do something like this, and here to do something like this. So it will be just easier to understand how the logic is actually working. Okay, so if reviews length, because it's always an array, it's always an object, it can be empty or contain some objects. So if it's if it's empty, because if it's 0, then it produces false, but we change it to the true. Okay, and that's the general syntax. So here we return something if true, here we return something if false, but we just made the opposition. So that's the case in which there are no elements, and that's the case in which there are some elements. Okay, so if there is nothing, I can create a simple div. Okay, we can add some class name. Okay, and just h3 no reviews And of course, if we don't have any idea what we can return null, which is probably not the smartest way. Okay, as you see, it's working. So in first case, the reviews is empty. So this produces the true. So we render this part. And if we will fetch them, nothing will be rendered because the element is no longer, the list is no longer empty. So, okay, right here, let's start rendering something. So we have a list of elements of JSON objects. So we can map them. This is the cool stuff about the JSX, that it allows us to make all normal JavaScript operations to just produce React elements. So we will map those objects, and that each object will be a review that will return us, for example, okay, so we can, as for testing, use the review ID label. Okay, and that should work, I believe. Okay, let's check. Oh, okay, yeah. If you want to render some JavaScript value, then you have to put it in curly braces, because that's obviously the code. And whoa, that's not working. Okay, review is not defined. Dashboard.js line 65 review. Sorry, my mistake. Yeah, so each element of the list, of course, should have a unique key, because React re-renders only those objects that has changed. So we have, if we have a long list of elements and only a couple of them will change, React will compare those which has changed and only re-render those which need to be re-rendered to just make everything more efficient. But rendering objects in this form is not very efficient, and the general rule is that if there is something, if there is an object that's more sophisticated, we would like to put like the maybe author, title, and the details of the review, then it's worth to just create another component, and we will do so. So we'll just create a new component, and this will be a function component. So we will just import React from React. Okay, that will be review, which get props. But yeah, of course, with the new syntax, we can do also something like this. For some of you, maybe that's just easier to understand. And we need to just have one function return that will return something for us. At first, I believe that it's worth to use the structuring to get the only those variables from props that we will use. So to just remind you, the props in this case will be the JSON object of the review. So I know the structure, content ID, app ID. Okay. Yeah, so right now it will be much easier to access those variables, and we can create a div with specific class name, maybe cart empty free. That should be fine. And then we can create a div class name card body. To just remind you that all comes from the Bootstrap. I selected the Bootstrap because it's very simple to understand, and it's not so sophisticated as Material UI, which is very popular, and I also like to use it best. But as I mentioned, for simple projects, it's worth to use simple things. So once again, we will use the curly braces, and we will put a title label in the header, and then we can put some paragraph, class name, card text, and once again in curly braces we'll use. Okay, so we will use the ID and app ID later on. That's not important right now. So we have a single div in which there is another div. It will be card object. We have title and text, and in those objects we will just render the values of taken from the props, so directly from the JavaScript. And okay, right here we can now import the review right here. Oh, we didn't export it. Okay, that's it. We'll just need to import review from. Okay, and right here, instead of rendering some custom objects, we will just return our review object, review component. Okay, so we have to add a key. So as I mentioned, for React to know if it should be re-rendered or not, and then we can provide a custom prop, which will be app ID, and we will take it from the state. And yeah, but we don't have to use the this state dot app ID. We can just use app ID, and then we can provide everything else using the structuring. Okay, so we provided all needed details to review component, and we also imported that. So hopefully that should be rendered and should work. Yeah, so maybe it's not working perfect, but it looks like the reviews are being rendered. Maybe let's check what might be the issue. Review. That should fine. Yeah, maybe that should also be wrapped in a full length row. Okay. Yeah, maybe. let's try to do something like this, and if not, then we'll just skip this process. Yeah, right now each element is extended to the full length of the container. So this is exactly what we want to do. And okay, so right now we have a class component and function component, and at this point we could end our journey, but I would like to show you also more sophisticated function component and the way in which we can navigate through the different pages. And for this reason, we will need, as I mentioned before, the rich router. So right now, let's go back to the app.js and let's import the router. We have to router from rich router. Okay, and router allows us to render different components under different URL paths. So our dashboard will be under default path. So every time we'll go to the main page, we will go to the dashboard, and we will have the second big component. It will be called details. Actually, we can just create it first, so it will be easier to understand. The details will present more details about each review. So we will present author, maybe the version of the app, and so on. So for details, we'll create, we'll import React from React const. It will be very simple component right now, because we would like to just be able to show how it's working, and then we'll build the content. So it will be div, okay, export default details. Okay, format that, and let's import details from details. Okay, so as I mentioned, if we'll go to the main path, we'll render the dashboard, and we'll render details if the path will be different. So okay, path might be equal to /details, but we'll also need to provide a couple values in the URL. So the first value might be app ID, because we need to know what app ID we are just for which app ID review we are presenting, and then there will be review ID, and we can add as many elements here as we want. And under these names, app ID and review ID, those values will be accessible in the details component through the props, because that's just injected to the props object. So if we'll go to the localhost 1234/details/1/2, it will try to render our details component with the props of app ID 1 and review ID 2. Okay, so that looks pretty simple, and we should be able to render the details. However, we also need to be able to navigate to the details. So we can right now change the review and just wrap the card into the, okay, we need to import the link. So link will allow us to navigate to a different page. And in JSX, it will be link. Okay, we can wrap this into link. And the link has one parameter. That's, of course, in curly braces. And then we can use a template string. And the URL will be /details/ and if we want to inject some value here, we can use $ and curly braces, and that will be app ID $, curly braces, and that will be ID label. The dot label format is caused by the format provided by Apple. This is how they structure their reviews, and we have no impact on that. Okay, so right now, if we will fetch the reviews and we'll press that, as you see, it should backend.js dashboard. Yeah, there's some missing key somewhere probably, but we can fix that later on. So if we press the review, it will redirect us to details / the free, it's the app ID, and then the review ID. So in this tutorial, we won't use context to somehow provide the fetched reviews to the details website, because in most cases, it looks like you are going to some details and you ask your API to give you details of particular object. So we will try to use the same behavior. We will just go to the details component and it will ask the Apple for the review for all the reviews and just filter the one that we are really interested in. I don't know what are the limits of requests to Apple, but hopefully we'll be still able to build it and verify if that's really working. Okay, so we are able to link. Yeah, there's a details component rendered here. Right now it's not so interesting, so maybe let's go back to the dashboard. So yeah, right here we don't need to do any changes. Okay. Okay, so we can start working on details. So as I mentioned, this is the function component, and right here I will tell you something about hooks. So hooks are very simple syntax introduced last year, added to the React, and they make development, especially for beginners, much easier. So the learning curve is much better. However, you can only use them in function components. You cannot use them in class components, which is somehow tricky as for me, because previously introduced classes were some step forward, and then we introduced the hooks, which are like next step forward, but they don't use the previous step forward. So okay, anyway, hooks allows you to for example, use state much easier and manipulate it much easier. And there are two hooks that are very popular: useState and useEffect. So I will try to explain you both of them. Anyway, let's maybe start with the return function. So what we'll try to return will be a container in which we'll have a review. And to save you some time, I will just copy the code I already prepared because it will be just much easier. Okay. So we have to close those diffs and close return. Okay. So we have container and we have row. And right here, we will need to render review details. However, when we just enter the component and we will render that the first time, we don't have the review. So because of that, we'll just use the conditional rendering right here. But we need to store somewhere the review, and that's where we'll use our first hook. It will be useState. So at first, let's import the useState and useEffect. Okay, so useState is pretty simple. So we create an array of consts, and the first is the name of the variable that will be stored in our state. It will be called review. And the second is a method that will be called to manipulate that. So we can call it setReview. Set and the name of the variable is probably the easiest way to always remember how to manipulate state. And then we call useState and we provide default values. So our default value will be null because we don't have the review. Okay, and right now we can use the conditional rendering. So if there is a review, then we'll return some details about the review. And if there is no review, we'll simply return null. Okay, so within this, once again, I will just save you some time and copy the HTML that I prepared previously. So as in any other case, we have the review object and we use curly braces to render that inside the HTML tags. So we will just put the title, the content, and then we'll use the template format to show the author, version, and version of the review. Okay, there's nothing very interesting about that. So as you may wonder, if we go here, nothing happens, nothing is being rendered. Okay, so right now when we enter the details, we would like to fetch the data and update the state, which is pretty obvious. So to do this, we will use the second most popular hook. It's called useEffect. And the useEffect is very interesting because it allows us to call some method, some logic every time that some dependency will change. So the first parameter to useEffect is the block of code that will be executed every time the variable will change, and the second is the array of variables that will be monitored by this useEffect. So right here, if you would like to call this method only once when we just enter the component, we could leave the array empty, and it will be executed only once when we just enter the component. So right here, we would like to request reviews. So as in the case, as in previous case, we can just copy the method from the dashboard, and we will reuse part of this code. And of course, we have to change that, but in general, yeah, we can call it, okay, async function request reviews, and right here we can call request reviews. So every time we go to the details page and the details component will be rendered, the useEffect will be called only once at the beginning, and it will call the request reviews. So request reviews will create a URL, and we won't access this state because there's no this. We will get the app ID from props, because this app ID is available here through the props, because when we created the route for that, we said that the first parameter after the details will be called app ID, and the second will be called review ID. So if we render a page, we have access to the app ID through the props. We can console the URL, we can call the fetch, and then we also can get the reviews, and this is the point which is different. So right now we will have to filter the review, because we are only interested in one review. So we can use the filter reviews, filter review if review.id.label is equals to props review ID, and then we have to filter that, and filter produces an array, and we only want the first object, so we can use the array syntax to get the first object, and then we can call set review and provide the review. So as I mentioned, the set review is the name of the method that it's able to manipulate the state, and it will change the value of review. So whatever we provide here will be set as a review in the state of this component. Sorry. And because the state will be changed, the React.js will re-render this component. We'll use the conditional rendering and check that right now review is not null, and it should render this block of code, and everything should be working pretty fine, I believe. Yeah, and it is working pretty fine. So going back to the dashboard, we have the very basic path. It's the main path. We fetch the reviews, we present the list of them, and we can call this review. It will redirect us to the new URL, which contains the app ID and review ID, and in the details component we fetch the data for this app ID using props, then filter only this review by using the props review ID, and present the data render right here. Okay, looks like we are at the end of our tutorial. So I hope you now understand the basic concepts of the React.js, you will be able to build a very simple app with the form to get some data and then redirect to some details website, providing some details through the URL, and then presenting the details and maybe fetching some additional data. So this is the very common pattern that I see in many apps. So if you need to build some very simple app, then this tutorial would definitely help you. Of course, the source code for this tutorial will be linked down below the video, and I can only say thank you for spending your time with me. Thank you for watching this video, and see you next time. Bye.